Hi, isn't it interesting that Jordan Peterson is attacked by two sides simultaneously? On the one hand, you have, of course, the postmodernists, but on the other hand, you have the what you might call Enlightenment warrior types. So, in my opinion, if someone's attacked by both camps, by two opposing sides, chances are he's onto something. So, in order to make sense of Jordan Peterson's philosophy and where this whole conflict came from, let me give you a very brief and very low resolution introduction into the philosophical conflicts and how they emerged. So, how did this whole mess come about? René Descartes, the French philosopher who wrote in the 17th century, basically postulated that there's a fundamental difference between matter on the one hand and spirit on the other hand. Matter, of course, is the materialist universe, what we can touch, like the empirical stuff. And on the other hand, you have the spirit, which includes the human consciousness, of course, but also things like God and angels. Because the Enlightenment people, we must remember, were religious folks. Now, out of this Cartesian dualism, as it's called, there emerged two schools of thought, basically. One is called idealism, with Immanuel Kant being one of the most well-known specimen of this type of philosophy, of course. And this emphasized the role of the spirit world, right? Like consciousness and how it, in a certain sense, constructs material reality. So for Kant, there were like categories, certain filters in the head or in the mind that kind of filtered everything that comes through the senses, and in a way the material world didn't really exist in his opinion. It's a construction of the mind, basically. That's also the reason why Stephen Hicks, in his book Explaining Postmodernism, where he attacks postmodernism rather brutally, includes Kant in his long line of villains in philosophy, basically. Because, as you know, we Germans are always the bad guys. I think Hicks got it a bit wrong, but there's a kernel of truth in it, because the postmodernists kind of took this idealist thinking and ran with it, right? So no longer do you only have a filter in your mind, but it's kind of the idea that the whole world is just in your head. It's all like subjective, right? So there is no truth, there is no empirical data. This just doesn't exist. Everyone's living in their own heads. So that's, of course, how this whole mess that we see with postmodernism comes about. Like the moral relativism that we see, there are no values, everything's just, random, and everyone can do whatever the hell they want. This type of thought. There's something related called cultural relativism, the idea that no culture has real values. It's all like relative to the culture at hand. The problem with this view, of course, is that it's just rubbish. It doesn't make sense. We're obviously not living in our heads. There are such things as facts. There are such things as empirical data. So it's pretty much nonsense. If you want to read a great book completely demolishing postmodernism, and from a lefty no less, you can read David Detmer's Challenging Postmodernism, Philosophy and the Politics of Truth. It's a devastating attack. One of the primary reasons why this whole postmodernist relativist thinking doesn't make any sense is that if you deny that truth exists, then this claim in itself is a truth claim, right? So you could argue, well, if truth doesn't exist, don't tell me that it doesn't exist, because you have no right claiming that. I have my truth. I say truth exists. And the same, of course, is true for the kind of cultural relativism. And there are many, many more problems. The whole thing is completely contradictory and ridiculous. That's kind of where it comes from, right? It's this Cartesian dualism where you have this split between matter and spirit, and the postmodernists are kind of descendants, if you will, from the spirit side of this equation. Now, on the other hand, you have the materialists, right? These are the people in the Cartesian dualism who came out of the matter side of the equation. It's the idea that all there is in the universe is material. Everything can be reduced to, atoms or what have you, and it's all materialistic. This kind of thing didn't really exist so much in the Enlightenment, but came later, like in the 18th and 19th century, with all the great success of the sciences and all of that. So what the materialists basically did was, with a stroke of a pen, eliminating Descartes' spirit world. So they basically said, well, we have spirit and we have matter, but spirits don't really exist. It's all nonsense. God doesn't exist. Angels don't exist. So let's do away completely with this kind of thing and postulate that all there is matter, basically. Now, the problem with this view is that once you adopt it, you must give up free will. Because if everything is determined in terms of matter, you have like a causal system. Everything is caused by, like atoms, billiard balls bouncing around and all of that. You can analyze everything in terms of material causes. But if I have free will and I can decide what I want to do or take a certain action, then of course this screws up the whole philosophy, because then I break the causal chain, right? If I really have an option, if I really can choose if I eat bacon or eggs in the morning, then of course I break the whole materialist understanding. My consciousness introduces a new cause, if you will, or a new effect into the material world that is disconnected from it. That's why it's called the hard problem. How does consciousness emerge? How does consciousness interact with matter? Of course, the materialists came up with all kinds of solutions, if you want to call them that. Like, it's all an illusion, like my consciousness doesn't really exist, but illusion in itself is consciousness, so that doesn't really fly. Or it's all an epiphenomenon and all of that. But again, just like with postmodernism, that just doesn't make any sense. It flies in the face of our daily experience. Our whole legal system is predicated upon free will. Our whole existence is predicated upon consciousness, upon our decisions and all of that. So it doesn't make sense, right? And by the way, both of these views, both materialism and postmodernism, they kind of imply a certain nihilism, i.e. the idea that nothing really matters, right? Because of course, in the materialist view, if I don't have free will and everything is determined and everything is just matter, and like you come into this random world and then you die and it just doesn't make any difference and you can't even decide, and like it's nobody lives really that way, but it's kind of a nihilism that keeps creeping in if you really are a diehard materialist. So what's the point, basically? I mean, I might as well live a hedonistic life, and just don't care because it's all predetermined, doesn't make any difference and all of that. For the postmodernists, it's kind of the same thing. If you live only in your head, like the other side of the Cartesian equation, then you can do whatever the hell you want, right? There are no restraints, that there's no objective truth that kind of binds you or guides you or whatever. You just do whatever you want. And of course, we see that kind of thing happening a lot in today's postmodern world. So you have these two kinds of poles. I think it's interesting to think about it and where Jordan Peterson fits in here. Because obviously people in the past have also recognized this problem, and there were some solutions that people offered. For example, what is called panpsychism is a philosophy that tries to bridge the gap between matter and consciousness by postulating that at the end of the day, there's consciousness even in matter to a certain extent. So consciousness is all encompassing, right? So everything is conscious a little bit on some level. And of course, there are degrees. So it's the idea that consciousness is kind of everywhere, instead of having this gap between spirit and matter that cannot really be bridged if you think about it like Descartes does, that it's something completely different, right? So Leibniz was one of these, Spinoza, these were people who postulated a different view. And perhaps most interestingly, the mathematician Alfred North Whitehead, who wrote in the early 20th century, I think, he also proposed a panpsychism kind of view. He thought that mind is something that points to the future. So that's pretty close to what Jordan Peterson says, right? Jordan Peterson says that we materialize possibilities using our consciousness. So we have this realm of possibilities, of possible futures, and once we take a decision, we kind of collapse it into the material world, we actualize it. So in that sense, we have a choice. And Whitehead thought about it in similar terms. If you want to read some more about Whitehead, you can read David Ray Griffin's books. One is called Whitehead's Radically Different Postmodern Philosophy, where you can already see that it's an attempt to bridge the gap, to get beyond the modernist materialist view. There are not so many solutions around, but everyone kind of feels that there needs to be a solution. The view that all there is like atoms, billiard balls bouncing around, it doesn't make sense. And the view that we're living all in our heads and everything is subjective obviously doesn't make any sense either. So what's Jordan Peterson's solution? Well, you could say that since we bring possibilities into the material world, we do kind of create our own reality, right? But it's not like in the new age sense, like I just keep thinking about getting rich and suddenly it will happen. Of course, that's complete nonsense. And Jordan Peterson would never endorse something like that. But in a certain sense, we do create our own reality. The only thing is that there are very, very, very tight limits and rules how we can create the reality we want or we strive towards. So it's not anything goes, and it's not just like think something and then it will materialize. It's more that it's a very narrow path. That is really bound by all kinds of limitations. And here I think is where Peterson's archetypes come in. The idea that via stories we transmit these kind of deep rules, these kinds of deep limits and ways that lead to this kind of narrow path, right? I think that's where it's coming from, like the hero's archetype and all of that. And that's pretty interesting because it gives something we can follow. It gives something that we can try and see how it goes until we bump against these limitations and then think some more. He offers a path ahead, a way forward. And it's also very pragmatic. So Jordan Peterson always emphasizes that his philosophy is very pragmatic. Truth for him is something that works, right? And that's the ultimate goal, to better ourselves, to become better human beings in a spiritual sense, to strive towards something higher, as he always emphasizes. And while he's not really railing against materialism or something like that, as he always says, he tries to come up with materialist answers first before he postulates some other world or some spiritual things. But then again, he also employs religious language very much, and I think for good reasons, because you need this kind of religious language that points to another reality, to something higher, if you want to talk about these issues. So in that sense, he's really anti-materialist as much as he's anti-postmodernist. And I think that's the reason why kind of these Enlightenment warrior atheist types also hate him. I think this Cartesian split and the bad consequence that happened afterwards are really important to understand some of the conflicts going on, such as between science and religion, between Enlightenment warriors and postmodernists and all of that. And also between things like, you know, the behaviorists, right, who thought that there is no subjectivity, we can just analyze humans and animals mechanically. The only thing that matters is how people behave, but the consciousness doesn't play any role whatsoever. That was the one camp. The other camp, of course, were the psychoanalysts, most notably Carl Jung, who had a much different view and emphasized the spirit part, right? So in that sense, it's, again, fascinating to see how Jordan Peterson incorporates both of these views. He knows very well the behavioral school in psychology and he makes use of it. But on the other hand, he also makes use of Carl Jung, who in scientific circles is pretty much a persona non grata because he was, you know, like so out there with the spirituality and archetypes and what have you. So that's, again, Jordan Peterson bridging this gap between materialism and the spirit world, so to say. The same applies for his use of empirical data. He would never, you know, like say that empirical data doesn't matter like the postmodernists do. But then again, he also recognizes that it's not enough to just scream facts, 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 right? It doesn't work like that. You need a view that points to something more, to something beyond like the world of facts. And this is where consciousness comes into play. People can relate to that. People know that they are conscious beings and that their consciousness really, really does matter, and that their decisions do matter, and that there is an objectively good goal in life, you know, and this is all related to the world of consciousness, of archetypes, of God. Okay, so for those of you who are into philosophy, I hope I didn't slaughter the history of philosophy too much, and that what I said is more low resolution than it is wrong. But I think what unites us Jordan Peterson fans is that we are all willing to get beyond that kind of conflict that really didn't get us anywhere, right? So thanks a lot for watching and have a great day.